You're listening to The Vault, a Forum Communications podcast covering true crime and general intrigue in the Upper Midwest. I'm your host, Trisha Turinskis. On this episode, Forum digital editor Paula Qualm interviews Forum columnist Jim Shaw about the Medina Shootout. Jim recently wrote a 3-column series on the infamous shootout that occurred 4 decades ago. Here's Paula and Jim.
Hi everyone, I'm Paula Qualm, Inforum's digital managing editor. This month marks the 40th anniversary of what many believe is the most notorious shootout in North Dakota's history, or the crime of the century in the state, as some call it. The deadly shootout between several U.S. Marshals and law enforcement officers and Gordon Call, a farmer from Heaton, North Dakota, who was anti-federal government, anti-tax, anti-Semitic, and generally racist. Lives were lost, families were shattered, and still today, 4 decades later, there is pain and frustration and a certain fascination that is still felt with this case. Joining us today is Jim Shaw, a columnist for Forum Communications and a longtime reporter in this area. Jim, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Delighted to talk about this series.
Yeah. So I think there are few people in this world who know this case as well as you do. You've covered this extensively over the years, from the shootings to jailhouse interviews, and then even still today, you've been working and digging for more. And we'll get into all that. But first, I wondered if you could take us back, even before that deadly day, and just tell us about the main character here, Gordon Call. Who was he?
He was a contradiction in a way, because he was a World War II hero, a real patriot, highly decorated. And then after the war, he turned. His attitude changed, and he had real anger towards the federal government. He also, as you alluded to, was racist, anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. He was very concerned about what was happening to farmers, especially those who were losing their farms. But his anger towards the federal government, he showed it by he just refused to pay his federal taxes. And he just didn't believe in doing that. He didn't want his money going to where he didn't want it to be spent. Well, he was charged and convicted of tax evasion, went to prison. He was sentenced for 2 years, but he was released on 8 months, after 8 months, but he was put on probation for 5 years. So that meant that he had to report to the courts and to the probation officer, and he refused to do that. And because of that, that's what led us to the shootout, because by not doing that, there was a warrant for his arrest. Had he paid his taxes, or had he reported to the probation officer in the courts, there is no Medina Shootout.
Mm-hmm. And, let's go back and talk a little bit about how he changed, his thoughts and his convictions. He even started a group, did he not?
Yes, he started in Texas. He started the first chapter of Posse Comitatus there, because he lived in Texas when he was arrested and convicted and imprisoned. And then he moved back to North Dakota, where he was originally from. He moved back to North Dakota in the early 1980s. But he started the first Posse Comitatus meeting out in Texas. And then when he moved back to North Dakota, he got it going again here. And so he and his followers would meet periodically to have their plans of what they're going to do to fight the federal government, and their visions of creating their own township and who they would allow to live in their township. The big argument before the shooting, but while they were meeting, was would they allow blacks and Jews to live in their township?
Mm-hmm. Right. And he wasn't necessarily anti-tax altogether or anti-government. He was specifically anti-federal tax.
Anti-federal tax.
Yes.
He was okay with paying local taxes to support the school district or the fire department, but he was not going to pay federal taxes, and he just wouldn't.
And he had a group of followers around him. It wasn't just him. He got this. He had his son, his wife, and several other people around the community who had kind of taken on that same thought process.
That's very true. And he met with about 6 of them on the day. Again, what happened was they were meeting in Medina at the clinic of a local doctor, and a Stutsman County deputy sheriff, who just found out 2 weeks earlier that there was a warrant out for Gordon Call, spotted Gordon Call's car at that clinic, and he alerted the U.S. Marshals about this. So you had 2 U.S. Marshals from Fargo and 2 U.S. Marshals from Bismarck heading towards Medina to try to arrest Gordon Call.
And this is the day that you were speaking of, the day, correct?
The day, February 13th, 1983.
So tell us about that day.
Well, it was, I remember this because it was such a shocking time. It was an unusually mild day. Can you imagine highs in the 40s and 50s in the middle of February in North Dakota? Very quiet day. And so all the marshals had their days off. And when they were called, they had to drop what they were doing. They headed out there. They knew that this might not be smooth. So instead of just going to the clinic and trying to arrest them then and there, they waited for Gordon Call and the others to leave the clinic, and they set up a roadblock first in the city, and then the Medina police chief said you should move it, and they moved it outside of the city. They assumed they would cut off Gordon Call and his followers, and Gordon Call would just turn himself in. Obviously, it didn't happen that way. Gordon Call and the others run into the roadblock. They get out of their cars, and they come out with their rifles, and they're pointing them at the law enforcement officers, of which there are 6 of them, because besides the 2 marshals, there was the Stutsman County deputy, and there was a Medina police officer. This was a surprise. The law enforcement officers, the marshals, identified themselves, told them to put down their weapons, told them that they're just here for Gordon Call. Let's settle this peacefully. Nothing's happening. There's some shouting back and forth. They are pointing their guns at each other for 9 minutes.
That would be a very long 9 minutes.
9 long minutes, and nothing is happening. And finally, a shot is fired. And that shot hits Deputy Marshal Robert Cheshire in the chest. And to me, one of the most chilling things I ever heard, and this is when I covered the trial, was you heard Robert Cheshire calling in on the radio. These were his last words. Officer hit, officer hit. Let's go, guys. I'm hit bad. Yori Call fired that first shot, the son of Gordon Call. He denies it. He said Ken Muir started the shooting. But 2 other law enforcement officers who were there, Brad Kapp and Steve Schnabel, said it had to have come from Yori. And once that first shot was fired, then all hell broke loose. And there was firing at everybody. Boom, 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 boom. And it was all over in 30 seconds. But in that time period, Robert Cheshire, who was already wounded, he was shot dead. Gordon Call went over and finished him off by shooting him twice in the head, point blank range. Many people call it an execution. Ken Muir, the lead marshal, shot dead in the chest. Deputy Marshal James Hobson, shot in the head and the ear. He's down and out. 2 of the other law enforcement officers are shot. One of them badly, Bradley Capp. One of them in the thigh, Steve Schnabel, not so bad. The other law enforcement officer, the Marshal Carl Wigglesworth, goes off to the side to keep an eye on Scott Fall. Yuri Call is also shot by Bradley Capp, and he's down. So basically at the end of it, you have Gordon Call and Scott Fall firing at will. And one of the things that I remember from my interviews was, and I never heard this before, that the 2 remaining law enforcement officers who were up in the fray, Steve Schnabel and Brad Capp, they thought for sure they were going to die. They looked up. Gordon Call had them in their sights, dead to rights. There was no way out for them. Steve Schnabel, spur of the moment decision, which undoubtedly saved his life, takes his rifle, shotgun, throws it to the ground, raises his hands, says, "I'm done." And that was good enough for Gordon Call, who then came over and took his weapons. But can you imagine? Gordon then comes over and puts his rifle to Schnabel's neck. Schnabel's thinking he's going to shoot me, but he didn't. He just took his weapons and took his vehicle. For Brad Capp, Gordon Call just turned away at a second, and that was Capp's opportunity to run away into the ditch. Extraordinary that those 2 people are alive. Like I said, they both thought they were going to die. They both were wondering, where are the marshals? They had no idea what happened to the marshals. And to this day, as you will read, they both consider themselves very fortunate to be alive. This is all bonus years for them.
Okay, so the shooting is over. What happened then?
Then you had Carl Wigglesworth, the deputy marshal, who was a little outside of the fray because he was watching Scott Fall, come back and sees what happens to his colleagues, and he's stunned. And he calls in, and we have this on audio tape too. He calls in the fact that 2 are dead and 1 is badly wounded. These people are taken, that is, the survivors, are taken to the clinic, the same clinic where the meeting was a short time earlier, for treatment by this Dr. Clarence Martin. So there's Yuri Call, who is wounded. There's Bradley Capp, who is wounded. There's Steve Schnabel, who is wounded. There's James Hobson, who is wounded. Darrell Graff had actually, ahead of time, anticipating that it's going to be a problem, had lined up ambulances just in case. So he took to the clinic. The most fascinating part to me, though, is, so there's Bradley Capp being treated at this clinic, listening to Yuri Call scream about his injuries. And then in walks Gordon Call, heavily armed. And while Capp is being treated, he asks Gordon Call, "Was it worth it?" And Gordon Call says, "Yes, to me it was."
Oh.
That's just sorry, it was worth it to him to have 2 people killed, another person wounded and basically never himself again for the rest of his life, and others with significant wounds, and his own son being shot. And it was worth it to him. It was just so revealing. But this, again, gives you his state of mind of how much anger he had at the federal government and how determined he was to never go back to prison and to never pay federal taxes again.
Yeah, and really quite incredible, too, that there they are after this very dramatic and deadly incident. And you have, the sheriff laying there, wounded himself. And the person responsible for this walks in to the room in seemingly a casual way with weapons still.
How
could that even still happen?
Yeah, I mean, when does that ever happen again? When you come face to face just seconds later with the guy who was trying to kill you and did kill others. And you have a conversation with them.
Right. So tell me a little bit about what happened to Gordon Call after that day.
Well, it's interesting because once word got out what happened, this became a national issue with the FBI and the U.S. Marshal Service, and not to mention local law enforcement. And there was a quick effort to arrest anybody involved with this. And before, I would say in the next 24 hours, they arrested Scott Fall, or some of them turned themselves in. Scott Fall, Joan Call, wife of Gordon Call, David Brewer, who was there, Vern Wagner, who was there. Yori Call was in a hospital, so he was under guard. But there was no sight of Gordon. He had escaped. Nobody knew where he was. And I remember this because I was out there. There was a massive manhunt like I've never seen before for Gordon Call. I remember 2 days after the shootout, they went to his farmhouse in Heaton, and it was like the U.S. Army was there ready for war, and they were shooting up the place, mostly firing tear gas, trying to see if Gordon Call was in there. They really ruined the house, and Gordon Call was not there. As an aside, covering this, and so after the shooting of the house was done, I went into the house with one of Gordon Call's daughters to see what the house looked like. I had never been exposed to tear gas before, and I was overcome by this tear gas. I was burning up, and I had to get out of the house, and I needed some treatment just to water me down. And I ended up, must have been next door, I ended up going to Janice Call, wife of Yori Call, who was giving me wet cloths to deal with this tear gas, while her husband is in the hospital after being shot, don't know if he's going to survive, and all these other people were dead, and her father-in-law is on the loose. At any rate, they didn't find him there. The next day, we followed them into the town of Ashley, North Dakota. They went to basically every house in the town. They went to schools, couldn't find them. At that point, then, they set up this command center in Jamestown, and they went all over looking for him, looking for tips, looking for leads. They got a lot of tips, but they didn't get anywhere. They set up a reward of $25,000 leading to his capture, but there were no takers. At that time, $25,000 was considered a lot of money.
Sure.
And Gordon Call had eluded them. There was no hint at where he was. So they went ahead with the trial against everybody else 3 months later, which is awfully fast. 3 months later, while Gordon Call was still on the loose. 6 days after the trial, they find Gordon Call, after the trial was over.
Where was he?
And Gordon Call was in Arkansas. He was being hidden by people who were sympathetic to him and his movement. Mm-hmm. And law enforcement got a tip. So what happened was a local sheriff went into this house in Arkansas, finds Call hiding behind a refrigerator. The two virtually simultaneously shot at each other. Call was hit in the head, dies instantly. Sheriff Matthews was hit in the heart, still alive, trying to crawl his way out of the house, dies a couple minutes later. There's a big SWAT team outside that house. They see Matthews crawling out. They don't know what's happened to Call, and they just start firing at will at the house, causing a fire and explosions. But Gordon Call was dead. And a few weeks later, there was a funeral for Gordon Call, which I also covered. Unusual because of him, but he was treated as a very conflicted man. But he was praised for his patriotism and his World War II service, and supposedly for his love of the country. And they had 250 people there. And I remember when he was coming out, you had several veterans out there saluting the flag-draped coffin as Gordon Call is walking out. So it told me there still was some support for what Gordon Call stood for. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't where the pastor was saying what a wonderful guy he was. He acknowledged, without getting into the details, what Gordon Call had gotten himself into and what he had done. And so this is not a man to give high praise to.
So tell me a little bit about, what happened to the people surrounding Gordon Call. Yes, he ended up dying, but there was a lot of pain inflicted, not only to his victims and his victims' families, but to the people around him as well.
Right. You'll recall Gordon's son, the one who apparently started the shooting, convicted of murder, still in prison today. He's serving a life sentence, but he is eligible for parole. This is interesting. I didn't get into this in the story. The rules and laws at that time allowed someone like Yuri Call to be eligible for parole. Had the same crime taken place today, Yuri Call would not be eligible for parole. So same thing with Scott Fall, also convicted of murder, also eligible parole, but both of them are in prison, in federal prison to this day. David Brewer was convicted and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Vern Wagner cooperated with the government, so there was no sentence for him. Joan Call was acquitted, and in my judgment, that was the right decision. I was quite surprised that they charged her with aiding and abetting, and there were never any witnesses that they called to the stand to testify against Joan Call or to try to prove any case against Joan Call.
And that's,
so Joan Call was
Gordon's wife, Gordon Call's wife, Joan.
That is right. That was Gordon Call's wife. I'm sorry.
And you have actually audio of her kind of taking to the microphone, to TV, basically asking her husband when he was on the run to turn himself in.
Right. Very, very powerful video where she's crying and begging Gordon to turn himself in.
Please, Gordon. Please. He won't hurt you. I've been treated real well here. Our son is in critical condition. 2 men are dead. Others are going to be hurt. I don't want you dead too. Please. I can't take any more. Obviously,
he didn't do it. I'm assuming he saw it because I'm assuming he watched national media, but there was no way he was going to turn himself in. If he was going to turn himself in, he'd have done it on February 13th, 1983. This man was never going to be in a courtroom again or a prison again. He had made up his mind, despite his wife's emotional plea.
So tell me a little bit about his victims then and how things turned out for them. Even the ones that survived that day continued to really go through a lot.
And one thing that's interesting is because Scott Fall and Yuri Call are eligible for parole every now and then, this case has never gone away for the victims' families because they always have to make statements, give their thoughts to the federal government, to the Justice Department about releasing them. They don't want to be thinking about it anymore, but they don't want Yuri Call and Scott Fall released, and so therefore they have no choice. This is what they told me. The Muir family, that's Ken Muir, he was the U.S. Marshal. They suffer very much to this day. They still miss their dad, and they can't get over it. In all of them, it was a shock because nobody expected anything like this to happen in North Dakota. But Ken Muir really upset. Cheshire family, outside of a quick message from his daughter, didn't want to comment. But things have been, I can understand it because things have been so horrible for that family since. Not only did they lose Robert Cheshire, and he's only 32, but he had 3 children, and 2 of those children are now dead. One of them was killed by a drunk driver when he was 15 years old. So their tragedy has just continued.
Yeah.
The family that struck me the most was the Hobson family. James Hobson was the deputy marshal who was shot in the head and brain, suffered severe brain damage. was never the same again. He could barely walk. He could barely talk. He couldn't see well. He couldn't hear well. He was never anywhere near the same guy he was. He wasn't expected to survive, and amazingly, he did. Up until this series that I have done, the Hobsons have never spoken about anything about this.
Mm-hmm.
Not just to media folks like me, but amongst themselves. And this was an unexpected, wonderful feeling I received from doing this, is they thanked me for getting a hold of them. And believe me, it was very hard to find them. But they thanked me for doing it. So as a family, this is his 4 children, they could have their first discussion in 40 years about what happened and how this affected their lives. And it was so horrible. It was so hard for them to see their father, an invalid, just kind of sitting there doing nothing, not talking, not conversing, not understanding, not able to do anything. And one of them was very upset because he really wanted his father to be a fun-loving grandfather to his kids, but that couldn't happen. And the grandchildren would ask, "Well, what's the matter with Grandpa?" And that was a tough one. I mean, how much do you explain about that?
Yeah. Well, and he survived, but he was still taken from them.
Right. And he and his family are the overlooked victims.
Yeah.
Because of what they all went through and had to deal with this day after day after day with him. It changed the children, and it certainly changed his wife, Doris Hobson, who just became more tense and not as friendly and more fearful of things. So they really, really, really had a tough going. I mean, obviously the Cheshire and Muir families had it brutal because they missed their father on so many occasions. Carl Wigglesworth, the deputy marshal who discovered the bodies, was never the same again mentally. He even said to me that the old Carl died on February 13th, 1983.
No.
He is, and when he saw Robert Cheshire lying there, and mind you, Cheshire had been shot in the head, that he will never get that image out of his mind, which is too bad. Carl is no longer with us, but it was with him until his dying days. He went through a lot of therapy, a lot of counseling. He became more withdrawn, just not as fun-loving, and he admits all this. And he was very, very angry at these shooters for what they did.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, he just says they were cold-blooded killers, and they should never get out of prison.
Well, and from your columns, I've read too that they really maybe haven't shown a lot of remorse since. You did a jailhouse interview with Yuri. Right. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. They haven't. This is based, and I say this based on the interview I did from federal prison, the only federal prison television interview Yuri Call has ever done. And he expressed no remorse, didn't think he's guilty of anything, doesn't think he should be in prison.
Why do you think you should be let out? Why do I think I should be let out? I don't think I should have ever been here.
Also, doesn't believe in federal taxes.
You know, the income tax was not a part of the historical foundation of this country. In fact, this country was founded on the principle of a bloody fight against taxes. And taxes have always been a very, very evil that grows. Sometimes they're considered necessary, and I'm sure that certain types of taxes are necessary. The income tax, however, is it's a very dirty tax.
So, and I also, I found something he had written just a few months ago after he had been recently denied parole, and he basically wrote, you know, I'm an innocent guy, and I will probably die in jail. Scott Fall has never done an interview that I know of. So it was hard to know what was going on in his mind. But I thought, because with this series, I didn't want it to be just what happened in 1983. I wanted to take it to present day as much as I could. And 80% of the quotes were all from interviews in the last few months. Scott, so at any rate, as I'm working on this, I thought, what the heck? I'm going to write letters to Yori Call and Scott Fall in prison. I called the prisons and asked, how do I do this? And they told me what to do, and they told me very clearly all the rules, because if I violate a rule and I say something wrong, or if I even address it wrong, it's not going to get to them. So I made sure I knew all the rules.
Mm-hmm.
Sent them letters, just asked them again, what happened? Why do you think you should be released? Stories along the, or questions along those lines. Never heard back from Yori Call. And I identified myself as the person who had interviewed him in 1993.
Mm-hmm.
I was quite surprised to get a letter from Scott Fall. I never expected to hear from him. And to me, this is one of the real centerpieces of the series, to hear from Scott Fall for the first time since he was convicted.
Mm-hmm.
And Scott Fall is still very, very angry. He does not believe he had a fair trial, says he didn't really have a trial at all, is angry at the media, and angry at me, although he doesn't quite realize that at that time I was working for WDAY TV and not for the Fargo Forum. And he's so angry that he says, if you want to get the scoop of what happened that day, then you have to apologize for what you did, what you wrote, how you covered this. And also, not only do I have to apologize, but I have to state that these guys are innocent.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm not going to apologize and state that they're innocent. But it was just so interesting. Frankly, I thought his letter was better than anything I could have received if he had just answered the questions as I posed to him, where he would have told his version of what happened. This tells me what he's thinking to this day. This tells me about his anger and his perspective. And he just feels he was so badly treated. And
yeah, he answered your questions without you even asking them.
Right. He had so much passion in there, and you will be able to read the entire letters in the forum if you go there. But for both of them, as they try to get out on parole, as I understand it, because I've interviewed people from the federal government, this is not a good strategy if they want to get out. I am told that they will not be released with this attitude. If they want to get released, they have to admit their guilt. They have to admit what they did was wrong. They have to express some remorse. If they continue to say they did nothing wrong, they aren't guilty of anything, and they don't express any remorse, then they are going to be in prison for the rest of their lives.
That's amazing to think that they essentially have it spelled out in front of them of what they need to say in order to get out of prison, and yet they won't say it.
They won't do it. They are so convinced that they were in the right to take up arms and start shooting U.S. Marshals and local law enforcement officers because they were out to arrest Gordon Call on a legitimate warrant. They just will never come around to realizing that you just don't start shooting law enforcement officers.
Mm-hmm. This has been just an amazing, incredible. There's so many words to describe this, so sad and tragic and everything else surrounding it. And you've been there since the beginning. And so to me, that is what's incredible. And I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about this because you bring such a depth of knowledge with you in a way that I don't know who else could. So I guess I just want to pick your brain a little bit more, since you're in such a unique position here after all these years and you can continue to cover this. What are your thoughts on it? What has this made you think or feel as you have been so closely covering this story?
Well, it's interesting. And just to go back to when I started working on this, which was over a year ago. This is the longest project I've ever done in my career, but I just felt I should try to do it. And then I started putting together a list of, all right, who do I want to talk to? I didn't know how to find any of them. And some of them took me months and months, and I tried phone numbers that didn't get me anywhere, and I wrote letters that didn't go anywhere. And if I didn't find these people, then the story would have been dead. But because I did get them, I really have, I think, a stronger perspective on all this, because I can feel their thoughts to present day, because this will never go away. So, my thoughts are, again, this should never have happened. The U.S. Marshals were there with a legitimate warrant, and Gordon Call should have agreed to turn himself in and then let the system play out in the courts. However, and we talk about this a little bit in the series, there was a bad judgment from law enforcement about this. Darrell Graff, the Medina police chief, had tried to warn the marshals what they were getting into, and they had no idea. They had no idea that they were going to get into a gunfight, obviously. Yeah. And since then, the Marshal Service has kind of used this incident as a training guide about what to do and what not to do when you're going after somebody. This was an attempt to arrest Gordon Call without a plan. They just went out there and winged it and didn't realize how dangerous this could be. So now, in the future, there will be plans, or there are plans, so you don't do this again. Or you find a time where you can arrest somebody where they're hopefully by themselves and hopefully don't have their weapons handy, and you put them under surveillance. Frankly, maybe not inform the local police chief what's going on, just try to keep it under the radar. So there's some lessons to be learned. I mean, especially the families. It has just had such a profound, painful impact in their lives. For what?
You have a lot of details that we didn't talk about in your columns. And if anyone's interested in that, go to inforum.com and search for Jim Shaw's columns. We're going to be featuring them all together along with this interview and some video of that time. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks again for having me.